My name is Claire Whitfield, and until I was 26 years old, I believed my family loved my grandfather. I was wrong, and it took an $8 million penthouse and a forged signature to show me exactly how wrong I was. Grandpa Elias built his fortune from nothing. He grew up sharing a single bedroom with 4 siblings in a house that flooded every spring, and by the time he turned 40, he owned 3 shipping companies and a real estate portfolio that stretched across 2 continents. But none of that ever changed who he was underneath it. He still wore the same brown leather watch he bought with his first paycheck. He still ate breakfast standing up at the kitchen counter because, he said, sitting down felt like something rich people did to prove they had time to waste. He was the kind of man who remembered the name of every doorman, every driver, every waiter, and asked about their kids by name the next time he saw them. My father, Douglas, was his only son, and I think that's where the story really starts to curdle, because my father grew up in the shadow of everything Grandpa built without ever building anything himself. He inherited a taste for money without ever learning the discipline that made it. My mother, Renata, was worse in her own quiet way. She smiled at every family dinner and complimented Grandpa's health and vitality in a voice that always sounded like she was checking his pulse for the wrong reasons. I was the only one who used to just sit with him, not to ask for anything, not to hint about the company or the will or the townhouse in the city. I sat with him because when I was 9 years old and my parents' marriage was falling apart in screaming matches behind closed doors, Grandpa was the one who taught me chess in his study, patient and calm, letting me lose slowly instead of quickly so I'd learn something before I felt bad about it. He lived in the penthouse at Ashcombe Tower, the crown jewel of one of his own developments, 40 floors above the city with a wraparound terrace that looked like something out of a postcard. $8 million on paper. To him, it was just the place where he could still see the harbor lights at night, the way he used to see them from the cheap side of the water when he was a boy with nothing. The trouble began, as it so often does, with a small stumble that meant nothing and was made to mean everything. Grandpa had a dizzy spell in his kitchen one morning. Nothing dramatic, just low blood sugar and dehydration according to his doctor. But my father was the one who found him on the floor, and by the time I heard about it secondhand from a cousin, the story had already grown teeth. Within a week, my father was telling anyone who'd listen that Dad, that's what we all called Grandpa, strangely, out of some old family habit, was having serious cognitive episodes and wasn't safe living alone. I visited 2 days after the incident. Grandpa was sharper than I'd seen him in months, irritated mostly by the fact that everyone kept talking to him slowly like he was a child. "Your father wants me evaluated," he told me, stirring his tea with the same steady hand he'd always had. Evaluated for what I asked him, for getting old. Everyone's guilty of that eventually. I laughed with him that day. I didn't yet understand that my father wasn't joking. 3 weeks later, I got a call from my mother, sugar-coated in concern, asking if I could come to a family meeting about Grandpa's care. I should have known something was wrong the moment she used the word "we" so many times in one sentence. We think, we feel, we've decided as a family, because Grandpa hadn't been part of a single one of those decisions. The meeting took place in my parents' dining room, the kind of room that only gets used when someone wants an audience. My father sat at the head of the table like he was already CEO of something. My Aunt Priscilla, his sister, had flown in from Chicago, which alone told me the stakes had changed, because Priscilla didn't fly anywhere for less than money. My cousin Marcus, always eager to be useful to whoever seemed to be winning, sat beside her nodding before anyone had even finished a sentence. My father opened with statistics. He'd apparently spoken to a specialist, though he never gave a name, about early-stage decline, and how it was common at Dad's age to experience moments of clarity that mask a much more serious condition underneath. He said this while looking at me, specifically at me, like he already knew I'd be the one to push back. "He's sharper than you are," I said. "He remembered my birthday before I did this year." My father's jaw tightened. "Claire, sweetheart, you're not a doctor." "Neither are you," I said. "Neither is whoever this mystery specialist is that you keep quoting." Priscilla leaned forward, her voice honey over steel. "We just want what's best for Dad. The penthouse is too much for him. All those stairs to the terrace, that big empty space, no one checking on him overnight. We think it's time he moved somewhere smaller, somewhere safer. And frankly, a property like that shouldn't sit empty for an old man rattling around in it alone." It could be liquidated, and the funds could be put toward round-the-clock care. There it was, not a whisper about love, not a single word about what Grandpa actually wanted, just an $8 million asset being measured for a price tag, while the man who owned it was still very much alive and very much in his right mind. I asked the obvious question. Has anyone actually asked him what he wants? Silence. My father shuffled papers he didn't need to shuffle. Marcus suddenly found his phone very interesting. Priscilla finally answered. We didn't want to upset him with the details until we had a plan in place. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't a family meeting. It was a strategy session, and I had walked into it as the only person in the room who hadn't already agreed to the plan. I left early, and I drove straight to Ashcombe Tower. Grandpa opened the door himself, in his slippers, a crossword puzzle half-finished on the side table. I told him everything. I watched something in his face change as I spoke, not fear, not confusion, but the calm, dangerous stillness of a man doing very fast math behind very slow eyes. They had a meeting, he said finally. Without me. They did. He nodded slowly, and then he did something I didn't expect. He smiled, not a happy smile. The smile of a man who built 3 companies from a flooded childhood bedroom and had apparently not forgotten a single lesson about how power actually works. Claire, he said, I want you to do something for me, and I want you to do it exactly as I ask, without telling your father, your aunt, or your cousin a single word about it. Over the next month, Grandpa Elias quietly began working with an attorney I'd never met before. A woman named Odalise Reyes who specialized in elder guardianship defense, the kind of lawyer who exists specifically to stop what my family was trying to do. She arranged for 2 independent geriatric evaluations, both of which found Grandpa fully competent, sharp, and entirely capable of managing his own affairs. She had him record a video statement, dated and notarized, explicitly stating his wishes regarding the penthouse and his estate, made specifically to preempt any future claim that he'd been coerced or manipulated. And then Grandpa asked me to keep visiting the family as if nothing had changed. He wanted to know exactly how far they'd go. It went further than either of us expected. 3 weeks later, my father showed up at the penthouse with paperwork already drawn up, a power of attorney document prepared by a lawyer of his own choosing that would have given him full control over Grandpa's finances, his medical decisions, and crucially, the authority to sell any property held in Grandpa's name. He brought it under the guise of just being prepared in case anything happens. He asked Grandpa to sign it, just as a precaution. Grandpa signed something that day. It wasn't what my father thought it was. What my father didn't know was that Odalise had prepared a decoy document identical in appearance to a standard POA form, but legally meaningless. A blank template with no binding authority, designed specifically to see whether my father would attempt to use it before Grandpa's real wishes were in place. My father, thinking he now held full authority over Grandpa's assets, made his first move 2 days later. He contacted a real estate broker to quietly list the Ashcombe Tower penthouse, off-market, to a private buyer, before Grandpa could change his mind. Or, as my father put it in an email I later saw with my own eyes, before the old man does something sentimental with it. Email was sent to Priscilla, forwarded through Marcus's account for reasons I still don't fully understand, and it landed, through a series of small mistakes people make when they think no one is watching, directly in Odalise Reyes' inbox. That single email was the mistake that ended everything. Grandpa called a family meeting of his own 2 weeks later. He didn't tell anyone what it was about. He asked everyone to come to the penthouse instead of my parents' dining room, which I think was its own quiet message. You will meet me on my ground, not yours. My father arrived confident, almost cheerful, clearly believing this was the moment Grandpa would finally hand over the reins. Priscilla brought a folder of her own, presumably full of retirement community brochures. Marcus brought nothing but his phone and his usual eagerness to be on the winning side of whatever was about to happen. Grandpa sat at the head of his own table this time, in his own home, and Odalise Reyes sat beside him with a folder considerably thicker than Priscilla's. I want to thank you all for coming, Grandpa said, because I think it's important that you hear this from me directly and not from a lawyer's letter. He laid out everything. The 2 independent competency evaluations confirming his full mental clarity. The notarized video statement. And then, quietly, almost gently, he laid out the forwarded email, the one where my father had described him as the old man standing in the way of a sale my father had no legal right to make. The color drained out of my father's face in real time. Priscilla's mouth opened and nothing came out. Marcus actually pushed his chair back from the table an inch, as if putting distance between himself and what was happening might somehow protect him from it. Power of attorney you had me sign, Grandpa continued, was not what you believed it to be. It grants you nothing. It never did. I wanted to see what you would do if you believed you already had control. Douglas, you tried to sell my home before I was even in the ground. My father tried to speak. Grandpa raised a single hand, and it was enough to silence a room that had spent 30 years learning to be quiet whenever he wanted them to be. Spent my whole life building something so that the people I love would never have to struggle the way I struggled as a boy, Grandpa said. I never imagined I'd have to protect what I built from my own son. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply told them calmly that the penthouse, along with the majority of his estate, had already been placed into an irrevocable trust, one that could not be touched, sold, or contested by anyone in that room, effective immediately. Priscilla would receive a modest, fixed distribution, enough to live comfortably, but nothing close to what she'd been quietly hopping to inherit. Marcus, whose only real contribution to the family had been unwavering loyalty to whoever held the most power in the room, was written out entirely. And my father was left with a single, devastating sentence written into the trust documents, which Odalise read aloud in a steady, professional voice. To my son Douglas, who tried to take my home before I had left it, I leave nothing but the hope that one day he understands what he almost destroyed. I sat there and watched 30 years of quiet resentment finally surface on my father's face, and for a strange, uncomfortable moment, I felt something close to pity for him, because I don't think he ever understood, until that exact second, that the man he'd been scheming against had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. Grandpa turned to me last. In front of everyone, he told them that the penthouse, the actual $8 million apartment they had tried to sell out from under him, would be held in trust for me, not to sell, not to cash in, but to live in, to keep, to fill one day with my own family the way he'd once hoped to fill it with his. Not because I was owed anything, he said, but because I was the only one who ever sat with him without wanting something from him first. My father didn't speak to me for almost a year after that. Priscilla sent one furious voicemail and then vanished into silence. Marcus tried to reach out months later, once it became clear which side of the family still had money and which didn't, and I let that call go straight to voicemail too. Grandpa Elias passed away 2 years later, peacefully, in his sleep, in the home he'd fought to keep out of the hands of the people who were supposed to protect him. I still live there. I still see the harbor lights every night from the same terrace where he taught me to play chess, letting me lose slowly so I could learn something before I felt bad about it. Sometimes I think about that family meeting in my parents' dining room, the one where nobody thought to ask the man at the center of it all what he actually wanted. I think about how close they came to getting away with it, and how the only reason they didn't was because one 80-year-old man refused to believe that getting older meant losing the right to defend himself. He used to tell me that the real measure of wealth was never the size of the number in the bank account. It was whether the people around you loved you or just loved what you could give them. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I watched my own father prove which one he was, in real time, in front of the entire family, with a forwarded email he never should have sent. I understand it completely now. I should go back further, to explain why the wound between my father and me ran so deep, because none of this happened in a vacuum, and if you're going to understand why he was capable of what he did, you need to understand the boy he used to be before he became the man who tried to sell his own father's home out from under him. Douglas grew up in the shadow of Grandpa's rise, and I mean that literally. When Grandpa was still driving a rusted delivery truck at 4 a.m, my father was a small boy watching him leave before sunrise and come home after dark, and I think somewhere in that childhood, a resentment took root that never really left him, even after the money came. He used to tell me, on the rare occasions he talked about his own upbringing, that he swore he'd never make his own children wait the way he'd had to wait. What he never seemed to understand was that waiting wasn't the wound. Neglect was never the injury Grandpa caused him. The injury, if there was one, was that Douglas grew up watching sacrifice build an empire, and instead of learning the discipline behind it, he only learned the appetite for what it produced. By the time Douglas was 25, Grandpa had already made his first million, and my father had already developed the particular talent of spending money he hadn't earned as though he had. Grandpa bylaid him out of 2 failed business ventures in his 20s, a restaurant that lasted 8 months, a boutique investment firm that lasted less than a year, and both times, my father walked away blaming the market, blaming his partners, blaming anyone but the choices he'd made himself. Grandpa never lectured him publicly. He simply grew quieter every time it happened, the way people do when they're recalculating how much of themselves they're willing to keep giving to someone who never gives anything back. My mother married into this dynamic sometime in her late 20s, and whatever she felt for my father originally, I think it curdled quickly into something more transactional once she understood exactly how large a fortune stood behind him. She was polished in the way people are when they've rehearsed their own warmth so many times it starts to look like the real thing. I used to catch her doing math in her head during holidays, not obvious, not crude, just a certain stillness that crossed her face whenever Grandpa mentioned the company or the properties or his health. I was born into the middle of all this, the only grandchild for the first 11 years of my life, which meant I got an unusually large dose of Grandpa's attention before Marcus came along on Priscilla's side. He used to take me to his office on Saturdays when I was small, let me sit in his enormous leather chair while he took calls, let me sign fake documents with a toy stamp he kept in his desk drawer just for me. He never once, in all those years, tried to buy my affection. He earned it the slow way, the only way he knew how to do anything, brick by brick, morning by morning, promise kept after promise kept. So when the dizzy spell happened in his kitchen, and my father's story about it started growing details it didn't originally have, I wasn't just angry on principle. I recognized the shape of what was happening immediately, because I'd spent my whole life watching my father resent the discipline that built something he never built himself, and I understood, faster than perhaps I wanted to admit, that he had finally found what he considered a legitimate excuse to take without earning. The month between the family meeting and Grandpa calling Odalie's raise was the strangest month of my life, because I was living 2 versions of the same relationship with my parents. In one version, I sat across from them at dinner and nodded along as they talked about options for Grandpa's care, letting them believe I was simply undecided rather than actively working against them. In the other version, I drove to Ashcombe Tower 2 or 3 times a week, sat with Grandpa on his terrace, and helped him build the case that would eventually dismantle everything my father thought he was about to inherit. Odalie's raise turned out to be exactly the kind of lawyer Grandpa needed, precise, unemotional, allergic to wasted time. She'd spent almost 15 years specializing in cases of elder financial exploitation, and she told me during one of our early meetings that Grandpa's situation followed a pattern she'd seen dozens of times before. A sudden medical scare, however minor, used as the opening argument for a narrative of decline. A rushed push toward legal control, usually disguised as concern, and almost always an asset at the center of it valuable enough to justify the entire performance. The tell, she told me, is never the concern itself. Real concern doesn't come with paperwork already drawn up. The tell is how fast they move to control the money. 2 independent geriatric evaluations she arranged were conducted 3 weeks apart by different specialists, neither of whom had any knowledge of the other's involvement, specifically so that neither result could be dismissed as coordinated. Both came back with the same conclusion: full cognitive competency, no evidence of decline beyond what's typical and unremarkable for a man of his age. Odalie's had the reports notarized and sealed the same week Grandpa recorded his video statement, sitting upright in his study, statting clearly and calmly, on the record, exactly what he wanted done with his estate and exactly who he believed was attempting to manipulate the process, though he stopped short of naming names at that stage, wanting the paper trail to build itself rather than accusing anyone prematurely. The decoy power of attorney was Odalie's idea, and I remember being uneasy about it the first time Grandpa explained the plan to me, because it felt uncomfortably close to a trap. Grandpa's answer to that discomfort has stayed with me ever since. "Claire," he said, "I'm not setting a trap for an innocent man. I'm holding a door open to see who walks through it uninvited. If your father does nothing with that document, he loses nothing, and none of this matters. If he uses it, he'll have told me everything I need to know, in his own hand, without me having to ask him a single question. He used it in 6 days, the broker my father contacted. A man named Preston Doyle, who specialized in discreet, off-market luxury sales, later confirmed under Odalys's questioning that my father had described the sale as time-sensitive, and had specifically asked that the listing be kept quiet from certain family members until the deal was further along. A detail that, once documented, made it almost impossible for my father to later claim he'd simply been helping or exploring options on Grandpa's behalf. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. There was a night, about 2 weeks before the second family meeting, when I almost told my father everything. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for nearly 40 minutes, engine off, phone in my lap, genuinely torn about whether warning him counted as loyalty to a father I still, despite everything, loved in the complicated, aching way you love people who have disappointed you. What stopped me in the end wasn't strategy. It was a memory, my father, at Grandpa's 60th birthday party, pulling me aside to whisper that I should start being nicer to Grandpa because you never know how estates get divided. I was 19 years old when he said that to me. I remember how it made me feel, being treated less like a granddaughter and more like a shareholder he was trying to manage. I drove home that night without going inside. The second family meeting, the one at the penthouse, didn't happen all at once the way I described it before. It unfolded slowly, painfully, over almost 2 hours, and there were moments in the middle of it that I still think about more than the ending. There was a moment when Priscilla, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, tried to pivot the entire conversation toward emotion, standing up and saying, voice cracking with what I can only describe as performed grief, "Dad, we love you. Everything we did came from love, can't you see that?" And Grandpa, without raising his voice even slightly, asked her one question that silenced the entire room. "Priscilla, in the 3 months since my dizzy spell, how many times did you call to ask how I was feeling? And how many times did you call to ask about the penthouse?" She had no answer, because the honest answer, which Odalys later confirmed through phone records subpoenaed during the broader guardianship inquiry, was 0 calls about his health and 4 calls specifically referencing the property. There was a moment when Marcus, cornered and desperate to seem blameless, tried to claim he'd had no idea what my father and Priscilla were planning, that he was just here for support. Grandpa produced, calmly, a printed copy of a text message Marcus had sent to a family group chat weeks earlier, joking that once the old man's place finally sells, he was hopping for a new car out of his share. Marcus's face went the color of paper. And there was a moment, the hardest one for me personally, when my father finally turned to me directly in front of everyone and asked, with something that sounded almost like betrayal in his voice, "How long have you been working against me?" I remember the room going completely silent, waiting for my answer, and I remember Grandpa's hand finding my hand under the table, steady, the way it had been steady over a chessboard when I was 9 years old and losing slowly enough to learn something. "I wasn't working against you," I told him. "I was working for him. There's a difference even if you can't see it." Fallout after that meeting took months to fully settle. My father contested the trust structure once, quietly, through a lawyer of his own, but Odalys's documentation was airtight. The competency evaluations, the notarized statement, the forwarded email, the broker's testimony, and the challenge was withdrawn within weeks once his own attorney privately advised him he had no realistic chance of success and considerable risk of embarrassing legal consequences if he pushed further. Given how clearly the paper trail showed intent to sell an asset he had no authority over. My mother, for her part, never said a single word to me about any of it, then or since, which somehow felt like the most honest thing she ever did in the entire ordeal. Priscilla did eventually reach out again, almost a year later, not to apologize, but to ask, in a carefully worded email, whether I might consider advocating for a larger distribution on her behalf given her financial hardships. I didn't respond. Some doors, once you understand why they need to stay closed, are easier to leave shut than people expect. Grandpa lived 2 more years after that meeting, and they were, strangely, some of the lightest years I ever saw him have. Freed from the low hum of suspicion that had apparently been building in him longer than I realized, he later admitted he'd noticed small signs of my father's impatience for years before the dizzy spell gave him an opening. Grandpa seemed to exhale in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. He traveled a little. He took up painting badly and cheerfully. He had Sunday dinners with me on the terrace, just the two of us, where we didn't talk about money once. He passed away in his sleep on a Tuesday in early spring, and the funeral was smaller than my father probably expected, because Grandpa, in the last year of his life, had quietly distanced himself from most of the extended family that had shown its true colors during those 2 meetings. I spoke at the service. I didn't mention the trust, or the penthouse, or the forwarded email that had unraveled a scheme years in the making. I talked instead about a 9-year-old girl learning to lose slowly at chess in a study that smelled like old books and stronger coffee than a child should ever be allowed to smell, and about a man who built an empire so that the people he loved would never have to struggle, only to learn, far too late in life, that some of the people he loved were only ever loving the empire itself. I still live in the penthouse. I've repainted the study but kept the chessboard exactly where it always sat by the window. And some nights, when the harbor lights come up the way they always used to, I sit there alone and I think about how close an entire family came to getting away with something, simply because they assumed getting older meant losing the ability to see clearly. They were wrong about that. I hope, wherever he is, Grandpa knows I've never once forgotten why.